What's up, gang? Another L Night Runner film in the house tonight. Got a top 10 for you this evening, so let's talk about it. As both a screenwriter and a musician, the cinema-music connection has always been very important to me. Growing up in the 1980s, the original motion picture soundtrack really elevated. And by the time we got to the 1990s, it became an event in itself. Everybody was looking out for the soundtrack. That's why I wanted to take the time today to give you a countdown of my personal top 10 favorite movie soundtracks of the 1990s. Now, keep in mind this is just my personal opinion. If your opinions differ, I highly encourage you to list those in the comments. I'd love to see your top 10s as well. That all being said, let's get to it. My top 10 favorite movie soundtracks from the 1990s. Let's go. At number 10, we've got Romeo and Juliet. Leonardo DiCaprio, Claire Danes, John Leguizamo, classic movie. The 1990s version of Romeo and Juliet had a fabulous backdrop musically. Probably an underrated soundtrack. We saw such bands as Everclear, Radiohead. We had hit songs with Love Fool from the Cardigans and Number One Crush from Garbage, both songs ending up getting a lot of radio airplay at the time. Very eclectic soundtrack, as well as we also saw the dance track Young Hearts Run Free by Kim Mazel. And then of course we had the theme of the movie, or one of the themes of the movie, sung by then child singer Quentin Tarver with Everybody's Free. If you haven't caught his version of When Doves Cry presented in the film, I highly recommend it. At number 9, we've got the Spawn soundtrack. This was an interesting experiment in a soundtrack. In the 1990s, we saw a few different movies come out with soundtracks that involved the fusion of two different genres of music. This is what the Spawn soundtrack was at the time. In this case, we saw the fusion of rock bands, nu metal bands being merged with electronic artists of the time. We got some great fusion in this one. Some of my favorite tracks that are collaborations from some of my favorite bands at the time. You've got Korn and the Dust Brothers merging with Kick the PA, Crystal Method with Slayer, Sneaker Pimps were on the album, and my personal favorite was a track that merged Incubus with DJ Greyboy called Familiar. Not necessarily my favorite movie, but the compilation of songs was very well thought out, very well produced, and very interesting. That's why I threw the Spawn soundtrack at number 9. At number 8, we've got the 1994 film Above the Rim, starring Dwayne Martin, Tupac Shakur, classic basketball movie. If this soundtrack only had the song Regulate on it, it would still be on my top 10 countdown. That is how much of a banger that song was and still is. There's a bunch of deep cuts by R&B acts that you didn't catch on the radio. Part-Time Lover by H-Town, Anything by SWV. This was a Death Row release, so there's tons of Compton, LA artists on the soundtrack. CPO Boss Hogg, Lady of Rage, B. Rozelle, and of course a couple of great Dog Pound songs. In my opinion, this album was basically the peak of the G-Funk era right here. Tons of songs, pretty much all bangers. Above the Rim at number 8. At number 7, we got New Jack City. Released in 1991, this soundtrack features the New Jack style of R&B that was popular at the time. If you'll notice, some of my favorite soundtracks came out in a time when music was going through a bit of a change. This is definitely one of those times. This is before West Coast gangster rap took over, so the style of music was very upbeat, had a lot of bright colors within it. It was just a good time for R&B. Artists like Guy, Keith Sweat, Johnny Gill, but the main banger on that album, I Wanna Sex You Up by Color Me Bad. Just a complete oasis of R&B at the time. New Jack City, baby. At number 6, we got Natural Born Killers, 1994 Oliver Stone film starring Juliette Lewis and Woody Harrelson. This soundtrack was arranged by Trent Reznor, one of my favorite musical artists. And not only is this a movie soundtrack, but it's a complete soundscape within itself. A polarity of artists from Patsy Cline to L7 to the Dog Pound and the Cowboy Junkies. The opening track, Waiting for the Miracle by Leonard Cohen, sets an eerie tone for the entire soundtrack and the movie itself when you watch it. The best of the best are on this soundtrack right here. Everyone from Jane's Addiction, Dr. Dre, 9 Inch Nails. The arrangement of this soundtrack absolutely sets it apart. At number 5, we've got 1991's Boys in the Hood, a John Singleton film. Let's be honest, all John Singleton film soundtracks are excellent and probably belong on this countdown. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and say that this is probably an underrated selection on my list. I am going to leave it at 5, but I do acknowledge that it probably could be a bit higher. Released around the time of New Jack City, this was that same pivotal time in hip-hop. This was right before West Coast rap really broke out. Intuitively, you would think that the soundtrack for Boys in the Hood would be a lot of West Coast rap, but that's certainly not the truth. It's actually a variety of hip-hop from around the country. You got a little bit of 2 Live Crew on there. You got some of the lady rappers, Moni Love and Yo-Yo on there. Like I said, a very eclectic blend of music, deceptively eclectic, I would say. You've got everything from jazz, funk, southern rap. And though this video is about the movie soundtracks the songs selected, we're gonna give a shout out to the theme of this movie, Black on Black Crime by Stanley Clarke. It's the final track that serves for the musical theme of the movie, an absolute musical masterpiece, even if that particular narrative, the title, still doesn't hold up. Boys in the Hood soundtrack is the best soundtrack you didn't know was one of the best soundtracks. At number 4, we're going to go for the classic film 1994's Pulp Fiction. Another director that really knows what he's doing when it comes to arranging music for his movies. This is definitely my favorite Quentin Tarantino soundtrack. In fact, I would go out on a limb and say this is probably the most interesting group of songs that I've ever heard. Eclectic is an understatement. A lot of the time, my favorite songs are almost hits, and Pulp Fiction has quite a few of those. Kool and the Gang's Jungle Boogie, Let's Stay Together by Al Green, Flowers on the Wall by the Statler Brothers, but opening the movie and the soundtrack with Dick Dale's surf anthem, Misery Lou, is mind-boggling. Was mind-boggling. Still blows my mind to hear it. What a great intro to a movie, probably the best one I've ever heard. And not only was this an amazingly eclectic group of songs, but we even spawned a hit from this movie soundtrack. Girl, You'll Be a Woman Soon by Urge Overkill, climbing the charts with that banger right there. Pulp Fiction, crime movie soundtrack at number 4. At number 3, we've got Escape from LA. Another movie that is not my favorite film, but the music collection on this cannot be denied. Exclusive songs from bands like White Zombie and Deftones, unreleased songs from those bands. A really unique group of great and forgotten bands of the time. Another transitional time when alternative metal was kind of turning a leaf over to new metal. Bands like Clutch, Civ, Sex Pod, The Toadies, and of course Tool all adorn this beautiful collection of music. Again, not a great movie, but Escape from LA cannot be reckoned with by many soundtracks in the 1990s, in my opinion. At number 2, we have the epic classic 1994 movie, The Crow. This soundtrack personally changed my musical taste as a young person, getting me into the darker aspect of alternative metal and goth music at the time. This soundtrack is the perfect fusion of 90s alt metal, gothic, and industrial music, a true vibe in itself. We've got rare songs from Rage Against the Machine. 9 Inch Nails covers the Joy Division song Dead Souls. It's an amazing representation of the abundant talent at the time. This was probably the heyday of alternative rock in the 1990s. Violent Femmes, Henry Rollins Band, The Cure even makes an appearance, opening up the soundtrack on this album. An unequivocal arrangement of talent. You can practically see the dark, rainy landscape when listening to this soundtrack. Before I get into my number 1 selection, I want to give you a quick reminder to please subscribe and like this video right here. Also, before we get to number 1, I want to give shout outs to some of my honorable mentions, some of my other favorite 1990s soundtracks that didn't quite make the cut. Lost Highway for one, the dark Bill Pullman film, directed by David Lynch, another expert compilation of dark cinematic music. Mi Vida Loca, a great showcase of West Coast hip-hop combined with soul. The Allison Anders film, starring an unknown cast of actors from East LA. Menace to Society, featuring the MC8 song Straight Up Menace. Another great compilation of West Coast rap that was taking over the airwaves at the time. Speaking of the Hughes Brothers, another great soundtrack of theirs is the Dead President soundtrack. Deep cuts from the 1960s and 70s funk soul movement. And who could forget Dazed and Confused, probably the best compilation of your grandfather's baby boomer music. Let's not forget another Tupac film, Juice, starring Tupac and Omar Epps. And just outside of the list is the Seattle favorite Singles, featuring bands from the Seattle scene, Mother Love Bone, Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, Screaming Trees. Excellent soundtrack that just landed outside of my countdown right here. Alright friends, what's it gonna be? The number one soundtrack of the 1990s. According to me, of course, but I'm right. 1995's Friday. If in 1 million years another species discovers relics of our civilization, I hope it's the Friday soundtrack. This soundtrack represents everything great about the 1990s. The perfect fusion of West Coast rap and old school funk will always win. Dre and Cube reunited with back-to-back bangers to open up this album. You got the Isley Bros, Roger Troutman of Zapp and Roger, Bootsy and Bernie, Rick James even, we also got Scarface, the Alcoholics, even representing Latino rap in LA with Cypress Hill and Funk Dubious. This is the ultimate party album, still is, always will be. It's the ultimate album to blaze with your friends to, and there will never be another. Number one soundtrack of the 1990s. It's Friday, baby. Thanks for sticking around and checking out my top 10 1990s movie soundtracks. Tune in soon for the sequel, my top 10 movie soundtracks of the 1980s.